Russia's President Vladimir Putin has very few allies left after his catastrophic invasion of Ukraine turned much of the global community against him and his country. And even those few remaining partners, like North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un, are proving to be unreliable, with new reports indicating that Kim has essentially played Putin for a fool by sending old decaying ammunition that is now malfunctioning and even exploding in the faces of Russian troops along the front lines. This is yet more bad news for Putin and a stark symbol of how far Russia has fallen in the eyes of the world, reduced to begging for second-rate supplies just to keep this doomed, wasteful war going. Before the full-scale invasion, Russia might not have been the most popular nation on earth, but it still wielded substantial influence, and Putin could rely on reasonably strong relationships with a range of countries and leaders around the world. Then he made the colossal miscalculation of launching a full invasion of Ukraine, triggering an international backlash and turning large parts of the global community against him. Since then, dozens of countries have condemned Russia's aggression and its illegal occupation of Ukrainian territory. Many have openly accused the Kremlin of war crimes, and much of the Western world has responded with wave after wave of economic sanctions. Numerous states have also cut ties with Moscow, tearing up trade agreements and stepping back from cooperation. A small cluster of countries has nevertheless continued to stand by Russia throughout the war, but that list is very short. The world got a painfully clear look at how tiny Putin's circle of friends had become back in February 2023, when the United Nations voted on a resolution demanding an end to the war and calling on Russia to immediately withdraw its forces from Ukraine. Almost every country on earth backed the resolution, with only Russia itself, Belarus, Syria, North Korea, Mali, Nicaragua, and Eritrea voting against it. Even states that had long maintained relatively close relations with Moscow, including several Central Asian nations that historically relied on Russia for economic and political support, have begun edging away from Putin. Others, like China and India, have continued to buy Russian resources, particularly oil, and have become the two largest purchasers of Russian crude in recent years, but very few of Russia's partners have been willing to provide direct military assistance on the battlefield. North Korea is the major exception. Pyongyang has been loud and explicit in its diplomatic backing of Russia, even prior to the 2022 invasion, and was one of the small handful of countries that officially recognized Crimea as Russian territory back in 2017. Several months into the full-scale war, North Korea also recognized the so-called People's Republics of Luhansk and Donetsk, both of which are internationally recognized as Ukrainian territories, as supposedly independent statelets under Russia's wing, prompting Ukraine to sever diplomatic relations with Pyongyang altogether. From there, North Korea gradually escalated from rhetorical support to tangible involvement, moving from statements and declarations to large-scale arms shipments and even sending personnel. It has provided Russia with heavy weapons, including M1-9, 8-9 Koksan self-propelled howitzers and M1-9, 9-1 multiple rocket launcher systems, as well as thousands of North Korean troops, among them special forces units, demining experts, and construction workers tasked with rebuilding infrastructure in Russia's Kursk region after Ukrainian forces briefly pushed into and occupied parts of that area. In short, North Korea has become one of Russia's most active and visible allies in this war, and some of its most consequential contributions have come in the form of ammunition. No country can fight a prolonged war without a steady stream of shells and rockets. Even if an army fields the best tanks, the most advanced fighter jets, huge brigades and cutting-edge equipment, it still lives or dies by its supply of ammunition. History is filled with examples of offensives collapsing because frontline troops simply did not receive enough shells and bullets to keep the attack going or even to hold their ground. Ammunition has been particularly central in this conflict because Russia has relied heavily on a brutal strategy of attrition, trying to grind down Ukraine's defenses by constantly hammering them with drone swarms, bombing runs, artillery barrages, and human wave assaults, consuming staggering quantities of ammunition every single day in an attempt to inflict maximum damage. North Korea has played a major role in feeding that machine. According to expert estimates from South Korea, Pyongyang sent more than 13,000 shipping containers filled with munitions to Russia between mid-2022 and mid-2024, a volume equivalent to roughly 6,152,000 artillery shells of 152mm caliber. At the time, South Korea's Defense Intelligence Agency commented that in order to prepare for a protracted war in Ukraine, Russia had moved toward formalizing North Korea's role as a dedicated supply base for its weapons and ammunition needs. More recent data, however, paints a noticeably different picture. Vadim Skibitsky, deputy chief of Ukraine's defense intelligence, has stated that North Korea has supplied around 6.5 million artillery shells to Russia since 2023, but that the flow has dropped dramatically. In an interview with Reuters, he explained that the volume of North Korean shells reaching Russia in 2025 has declined by around 50% compared to 2024. He also noted that there was not a single documented shipment in September, and although deliveries resumed in October, the overall quantities were far lower than before. Several explanations could account for this trend, but two stand out as the most likely. The first is that North Korea is simply running out of ammunition that it is willing or able to send. Back in 2022, Pyongyang was widely reported to possess huge stockpiles of Soviet-caliber shells and other legacy munitions, making it relatively easy at first to dispatch massive consignments to Russia to fuel its offensive in Ukraine. Multiple reports also suggested that North Korean arms factories abruptly ramped up to maximum output in order to manufacture additional munitions for the Kremlin's forces. Over time, though, those old stocks have been steadily drained, which is hardly surprising given how heavily Russia has leaned on blunt firepower to wear down Ukrainian defenses along the entire front and beyond. In late 2022, for instance, the Russian military was firing an average of about 20,000 artillery shells per day, and Moscow reportedly set an annual target of around 5.5 million shells to give itself what it believed would be the best chance of victory. Those kinds of numbers are unsustainable even for a large state like Russia, long regarded as one of the world's major military powers. In reality, Russia's domestic industry is believed to be capable of producing only about 3 million shells a year, forcing the Kremlin to turn to North Korea to try to close the gap and reach that 5.5 million target. For a while, Pyongyang was able to help Russia get closer to those goals, but as the war drags on, maintaining those levels of support has become increasingly difficult. The second likely reason for the drop in shipments is that North Korea may now have other priorities competing for the same limited resources. Recently, its military proudly showed off what it claims is its latest and most advanced intercontinental ballistic missile, the Hwasong -20, advertised as being able to travel up to 9,300 miles, or roughly 15,000 kilometers, and reach any target within the territory of the United States. Pyongyang has also conducted numerous missile tests in recent months and has been pouring effort into a range of other military research and development programs. Skibitsky told Reuters, for example, that North Korea has been working to expand its drone production capacity and has already started large-scale manufacturing of two main categories of unmanned systems: short-range first-person view kamikaze drones and larger medium-range attack drones. All of this suggests that churning out artillery shells for Russia may have slipped down North Korea's priority list. For all of Kim Jong-un's bombastic rhetoric, North Korea is neither a vast nor a wealthy country and lacks the resources available to a major global power. Its leadership has to decide carefully where to direct manpower and industrial capacity, and its generals and planners may now feel that they must devote more attention to their own missile and drone programs rather than continually feeding Russia's guns. Whatever the precise mix of reasons, the outcome is clear. Russia is receiving fewer and fewer shells from North Korea, and that is a serious headache for the Kremlin. If Putin hopes to have any chance of winning this war, his army will need enormous quantities of ammunition, and Russia cannot produce enough on its own. If the trickle from Pyongyang continues to dry up, the Kremlin will rapidly run out of options, since it has no other ally as willing as North Korea has been to send munitions in such bulk. That will mean fewer shells moving toward critical positions at the front. Artillery crews and mechanized brigades will no longer have the firepower required to sustain the same tempo of attacks on Ukrainian positions, forcing Russian commanders to rewrite their plans around these new ammunition shortages. They may have to cut back the frequency or intensity of certain offensives or scale down operations in some sectors in order to conserve shells for the most strategically important areas. Those gaps and pauses could open new windows of opportunity for Ukraine to launch its own counteroffensives, to regroup and resupply, to strengthen its defensive lines, or even to retake bits of territory in regions where Russia's ammunition stocks are visibly dwindling. In short, the shrinking flow of North Korean shells is likely to become a crippling blow to Russia's war effort. The problem is not limited to quantity. The quality of North Korean ammunition is also deeply troubling for Russia. Ukrainian intelligence assessments suggest that nearly half of the shells supplied by Pyongyang are so old and unreliable that Russia cannot send them directly to the front and must instead refurbish them at its own facilities. That is the exact opposite of what Moscow wants. Ideally, Russian commanders would simply receive trains and ships full of North Korean ammunition and dispatch those shells immediately to frontline units, ready to be fired at Ukrainian positions without delay. Instead, every new batch arriving from North Korea has to be subjected to intensive quality checks, with workers inspecting which shells are even safe to use. Large quantities then have to be diverted to Russian arms plants to be repaired or upgraded before they can finally be sent to the troops. As a result, Russia is not only paying for this ammunition in the first place, it is also burning more of its own time, money, and industrial capacity to make sure the shells are functional. Even among those that are cleared for use and shipped straight to the front, a significant proportion turn out to be duds, as noted by Ukrainian political analyst Olena Kryshinivska in a 2024 report. She pointed out that Russia is also struggling to increase its domestic weapons and ammunition output because it lacks enough skilled workers. One telling example is Uralvagzavod, a tank manufacturer that had to draft in 250 convicts from a nearby prison to plug its labor shortages. At the same time, Russia has been drawing heavily on munitions from allies such as Belarus, Iran, and North Korea. Reports indicate that North Korea may have shipped the equivalent of roughly 3.152 million artillery shells since the previous August, and that its factories have been running at full capacity. Yet Ukrainian defense officials estimate that about half of the shells sent from North Korea are defective. Taken together, all of this is a humiliating indictment of Russia's current military standing. For decades, the Russian armed forces were portrayed as one of the most fearsome military machines on the planet, boasting a huge army, thousands of tanks, tens of thousands of armored vehicles, sophisticated missile systems, powerful artillery and air defenses, and large air and naval fleets. Governments around the world dreaded the possibility of direct confrontation with this supposedly unstoppable force. Today, that myth is crumbling in plain sight. Russia is still struggling to secure significant gains on the ground in Ukraine and has failed to decisively defeat a much smaller neighbor, while at the same time lowering itself to the point of buying outdated, unreliable ammunition from one of the few pariah allies it has left. Like many other aspects of Putin's war, this dependence on North Korean shells is fundamentally unsustainable. As already mentioned, Pyongyang cannot keep shipping millions of artillery rounds and other munitions to Russia forever. It simply does not possess endless stockpiles or infinite industrial capacity, as evidenced by the fact that shipments are already becoming smaller and more sporadic. Even if North Korea manages to keep delivering at least some shells to Moscow, a large share will continue to be faulty, that forces